The congressional chamber buzzed with idle chatter as the U.S. House convened for yet another foreign policy hearing. Cameras rolled, analysts whispered. The usual performance was underway, until Ibrahim Traoré entered. Flanked by two aides in traditional Burkinabe dress, Captain Traoré didn't wear a suit, didn't fake a smile, and didn't bother shaking hands. His presence alone sliced through the room like a blade through paper. He wasn't there to negotiate, he was there to confront. Ocasio-Cortez, seated near the front, leaned over to a colleague and whispered with a smirk, "He thinks he's a leader now?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. A microphone caught it. A camera framed it, and Twitter exploded within minutes. Traoré didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the room, not with arrogance, but with a calm that unsettled even the most seasoned politicians. He didn't look like a man who needed validation from Congress. He looked like a man who'd come to deliver a warning. "Madam Speaker," he began, his French-accented English crisp and firm, "I represent a people you've ignored, a continent you've plundered, and a future you fear." The room quieted slightly, phones lowered, pens stopped scratching, but Cortez, ever the media tactician, seized her moment. Rising slowly, she replied with a smile that was more venom than charm, "And what exactly qualifies you to lecture the United States? Your speeches? Your soldiers, or your Twitter followers?" The chamber snickered, but Traoré just stared. Unmoving, unbothered. "You mistake silence for weakness," he said coldly. "But that's because you've never seen what fury looks like when it's patient." A hush fell over the hall. The game had changed. This wasn't diplomacy, this was something deeper. This was war without bullets, yet. Ocasio-Cortez crossed her arms, visibly irritated now. The smirk faded just slightly, only slightly, as she glanced at the murmuring members behind her. The room wasn't laughing anymore. Not really. Something in Traoré's voice had pulled the oxygen out of the air. Something ancient. Something un-American. He stepped forward, the floor creaking under his boots, not leather loafers, not polished dress shoes, but the same boots he wore through the Sahel. "I didn't come here for applause," he said, turning slowly toward the cameras. "I came to remind you that Africa is not your cautionary tale. It is your reckoning." A low murmur moved like wind across the chamber. "You think you lead the world," Traoré continued, "because your missiles fly farther and your dollars speak louder. But neither missiles nor money can silence the voices of the buried." Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward on the table. "So what? You're threatening us now? You came into our house to do that?" "I came into your house," Traoré said, eyes fixed on hers, "to tell you it's not your house anymore." The statement hit like a hammer. Reporters looked up. C-SPAN cameras zoomed in. Somewhere backstage, an intern mouthed, "Oh my God. You mock my skin," Traoré added. "You mock my continent. But what you fear is not me, it's the end of your control." Cortez shot back, her voice sharp, "The United States doesn't fear anyone. Especially not Third World warlords who mistake chaos for courage." Traoré smiled now, not with warmth, but with a warrior's calm. "And that," he said, "is why empires fall. They think fire makes them immortal." Gasps. Real ones. Audible. He had just declared open ideological war. Not with hate, but with clarity. And clarity was contagious. The chamber had shifted. It no longer belonged to the one with the microphone, but to the one with the conviction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez straightened in her chair, trying to regain composure, but Traoré had struck a nerve that couldn't be laughed away. He pulled something from his pocket, a torn, blood-stained piece of cloth, faded but unmistakable, the colors of the Burkinabe flag. "This belonged to a girl named Awa," he said, 12 years old. "Bombed in a village no map here dares to name. She died without ever hearing the words, human rights." He placed it gently on the desk in front of him. Silence. No one moved. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "Africa doesn't need lectures from politicians who vote for war on Monday and post peace quotes on Friday," he continued. "We bleed while you posture." Cortez interjected, "Are you accusing us of hypocrisy? We've given billions in aid to Africa." Traoré didn't blink. "You didn't give it. You paid it back. In pennies. And in shame." The audience shifted uneasily. A few clapped, softly at first, then louder, until it was clear, the room was not entirely with her anymore. "You wear progress like a brand," Traoré said, "but we wear history like scars." Suddenly, a young African-American congressman stood from the backbenches. "Let him finish," he called. Gasps. No one interrupted Cortez. No one. But this time was different. Traoré walked slowly toward the center. "This isn't about aid, this is about ownership. You thought the 21st century would be your encore. I came to tell you, Africa is no longer your stage." With that, he turned his back, not in disrespect, but as a statement. The kind that lingers. The cameras pivoted as Traoré stepped away from the podium, his back turned to the very empire that once dictated Africa's every breath. The world was watching, and suddenly the narrative was no longer controlled by American pundits or scripted applause. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, momentarily silenced, now leaned forward, her voice laced with condescension. "You claim Africa stands free, yet here you are, in our hall, on our terms." Traoré paused mid-step. He turned slowly, his eyes piercing through her as if weighing her words against the centuries of blood beneath them. "You think this is your hall?" he asked, voice low but firm. "This building was raised on the illusion of equality, but it still smells of empire." He pointed upward, toward the towering ceiling of the UN chamber. "You hang flags and speak of peace, while drones fly and sanctions starve. You talk of democracy, so long as it serves your interests." The room buzzed. Several African delegates nodded. A few Middle Eastern representatives folded their arms, watching Cortez carefully. "I came here because silence is complicity," Traoré continued. "And Africa has been silent for too long." Ocasio-Cortez smirked again, but this time it faltered at the edges. "You want a revolution?" she said. "The world doesn't run on ideology, Mr. Traoré. It runs on power." His reply was instant. "Then thank you for confirming what we already knew, morality was never your compass." Then, unexpectedly, Traoré raised his fist, not in defiance, but in memory. "This is for Sankara, for Lumumba, for all who were told to know their place." Silence, again. But this time it was reverent. Even some American delegates sat stunned. The illusion had cracked. A journalist tweeted instantly, Cortez mocked him. Traoré turned history into a weapon. It began trending in seconds. And somewhere, in Harlem, in Johannesburg, in Gaza, in Port-au-Prince, people were watching. And they smiled. Outside the UN, the world was catching fire. Traoré's words had reached far beyond the walls of marble and protocol. They danced through the internet, flooded news feeds, ignited campuses, and resurrected memories buried in the backyards of old empires. But inside, the tension grew thick. Ocasio-Cortez stood still, blinking, as if recalibrating her posture from casual dismissal to tactical defense. Her smirk was gone now. Her next words weren't laced with sarcasm. They were sharp, scripted. "So, what's your endgame?" she asked. "You stand here, dressed in defiance, speaking of justice. But justice without structure is chaos. What do you really offer?" Traoré didn't flinch. "Structure," he echoed, "the structure that carved borders with blood, that replaced kings with corporations? That gives you this microphone while muting the children under rubble in Gaza?" He stepped forward, narrowing the distance between them. "The endgame is not chaos, it's awakening." A murmur ran through the chamber. Not from the Americans or Europeans, but from the global South. Delegates from Bolivia, South Africa, Yemen, they were leaning in now. Listening not just out of curiosity, but recognition. Ocasio-Cortez pressed on. "So what, you want to dismantle everything?" "No," Traoré said. "I want to rebuild, without asking permission from those who once broke us." He paused, scanning the chamber. "You call it radical. I call it necessary." Just then, someone stood up behind him. A representative from Senegal. Then another, from Chile. Then, in a move no one saw coming, a Native American delegate from the U.S. Tribal Affairs Council nodded silently, placing a single hand over his heart. Traoré didn't smile. he simply bowed his head, because this wasn't victory. It was a signal, like the wind before a storm. The world was listening. The center was trembling. He turned back to Ocasio-Cortez. "You asked if I think I'm a leader," he said. "But I'm not asking anyone to follow. I'm asking them to stand." Within hours of the confrontation, the UN floor was no longer just a diplomatic arena, it had become a spark chamber. The viral footage of Traoré's final words, "I'm not asking anyone to follow. I'm asking them to stand," was clipped, subtitled, translated, and projected onto buildings from Johannesburg to Sao Paulo. Meanwhile, Ocasio-Cortez was pulled into a closed-door session with US and EU diplomats. The corridors echoed with nervous whispers. "He's not just grandstanding," one aide muttered. "He's mobilizing." In Africa, flags were flown not for nations, but for ideas. Youth in Accra and Lagos held handmade banners with one word, "Rise." In Paris, students clashed with police as they chanted Traoré's speech in French. In Gaza, an underground school painted his face on a bombed wall, with the caption, "You are not forgotten." Traoré, however, didn't bask in any of it. He sat in a quiet hotel room overlooking the East River, staring at an old photo on his phone, his mother in Burkina Faso, braiding a child's hair by candlelight. That was what this was about. Not applause. Not fame. A knock at the door broke the silence. It was Ambassador Felix Yuma from the DRC. He entered with urgency. "You've awakened something. But now they're pushing back." "How?" Traoré asked. "The IMF just pulled funding from 3 joint African infrastructure projects. France is moving troops into coastal zones under the guise of counterterrorism. And Washington? They've called an emergency NATO briefing." Traoré's jaw clenched. "They're trying to squeeze us economically before we rise politically." Yuma nodded. "They want to remind the world who still holds the keys to the vault." Traoré stood slowly, putting the photo away. "Then it's time we stop asking for keys," he said. "And build doors they can't lock." That night, while Western media painted him as a disruptor, an unpredictable force, and a populist radical, something else happened. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, governments aligned under the Traoré doctrine. A pact was signed: no African resource shall be exported without the people's consent. It was bold, dangerous, and irreversible. The empire had heard him. Now, it was preparing to strike. By the next morning, it was no longer a diplomatic debate. It was war, just without bullets. U.S. financial institutions froze transactions linked to Burkina Faso and its new alliance partners. Western media accused Traoré of destabilizing global order, while intelligence leaks portrayed him as a possible proxy for rogue actors. France ramped up naval presence near West Africa, and the Pentagon leaked satellite images of suspicious movements along the Sahel. But Traoré didn't flinch. Inside a temporary office at the Burkinabe mission to the UN, Traoré stood before a wall map of Africa with red strings linking natural resources to corporate holdings. It looked less like a political display and more like a battlefield diagram. "We need to move faster," he said to his advisors. "Before they rewrite the headlines, again." Aide-de-camp Mariam Kaboré, sharp-eyed and unshaken, approached with a dossier. "Sir, the Saudis have requested a back channel. They're watching. So is Brazil. What about China? They're cautious. But watching too." He smiled. "Let them watch. We're not auditioning for empire, we're staging its funeral." Suddenly, news broke: an African oil pipeline deal, scheduled to launch in 48 hours, was cancelled under U.S. pressure. The move triggered panic across smaller African economies, threatening to unravel the unity Traoré had fought to build. Discontent spread. Ghana's president wavered. Kenya questioned its position. Senegal's parliament stalled on ratifying the Traoré doctrine. For the first time, doubt crept in. And then came a leak, a secret audio recording of a NATO official declaring, these children think they're sovereign. Cut the funds. Cut the trade. They'll crawl back. Traoré played the recording on national TV. His voice calm, measured, piercing. Let it be known, we are not children. We are the sons and daughters of a continent you bled dry. You fear our independence because you cannot control it. But fear is not leadership. And poverty is not destiny. Across Africa, the words caught fire. The streets pulsed again. Doubters turned back into believers. But in Washington, the gloves were coming off. A classified Pentagon memo was passed across the Situation Room table. 3 words were underlined in red ink: neutralize the narrative. The hallways of the United Nations buzzed with unease. Western envoys whispered in corners, African delegates stood taller than usual, and journalists circled like vultures over a battlefield that had yet to explode. But behind closed doors, a different kind of war unfolded, one waged with wiretaps, blackmail files, and veiled threats. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered the equation. In a televised roundtable hosted by CNN, Ocasio-Cortez was asked if she supported Traoré's stance. She paused, her trademark smirk surfacing. Ibrahim Traoré has passion, she said. But passion without process leads to chaos. Africa needs justice, not just bravado. Social media split in half within minutes. Hashtags like #TraoréTheTruth clashed with #bravado versus balance. Traoré, however, did not respond with tweets or press statements. He requested a formal debate, on the floor of the General Assembly. And to the world's astonishment, Ocasio-Cortez accepted. The day of the event, cameras flooded every corner of the UN building. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Rows of diplomats, policy analysts, and media elites leaned forward, waiting for fireworks. Ocasio-Cortez opened confidently. Leadership is not performance. It is discipline. Traoré's speeches might move crowds, but they do not move systems. Let us build bridges, not bonfires. She sat to resounding applause. Traoré walked to the podium, calm but thunderous in presence. You speak of bridges, he said, but forget they were built with our bones. You say we need systems, but fail to admit who designed them. Colonialism is not history, it's your infrastructure. We do not reject process. We reject permission. Silence. Not a cough. Not a camera click. Not even a breath. Then, an uproar. Half the chamber stood in ovation. The other half froze, eyes wide, lips pressed. Even some Western delegates clapped, hesitant, but real. And in the crowd, a Pentagon advisor texted one word back to Washington. Problem. The moment Traoré stepped down from the podium, the United Nations building transformed into a pressure chamber. Lobbyists stormed out. Reporters scrambled to rewrite their headlines. Cameras shifted from Ocasio-Cortez's controlled poise to Traoré's thunderous gravitas. A global narrative had been shattered, and a new one was forming in real time. Behind the scenes, the American delegation was rattled. In a closed-door strategy meeting, Ocasio-Cortez paced the room, visibly shaken. This man doesn't just resist the script, she muttered. He burns it. One diplomat asked, do we silence him, or listen? A silence fell that said more than any vote. Meanwhile, Traoré walked alone through the marble halls, refusing interviews, ignoring cameras. He didn't need spin. He had spoken the truth, and that truth had begun to rearrange loyalties. That night, protests erupted across Africa, not against Traoré, but in his name. Youth in Dakar, Lagos, Kinshasa and Bamako lit candles, waved handmade flags, and chanted not slogans, but philosophies. We do not reject process. We reject permission. Africa will not ask again. Even in New York, something stirred. At Columbia University, 1,000 students gathered and projected Traoré's speech onto the side of the International Affairs Building. Cheers echoed down Broadway. Meanwhile, Ocasio-Cortez was invited to a major MSNBC primetime panel to discuss her confrontation. She declined. Instead, she appeared on a live stream from her office, face bare, voice stripped of spin. I disagreed with Traoré's methods, she said. But I cannot deny the mirror he held up. Maybe it's not him we fear, but the part of us that knows he's right. The live stream ended with a single sentence displayed in silence. The world is changing, and we are no longer the ones changing it. That message reached everywhere. And in Ouagadougou, Traoré received a phone call from an unexpected source. Joe Biden's office. Mr. President, said the voice. The White House would like to talk. Privately. Ouagadougou, midnight. The call from the White House ended, not with a demand, but with a request. How do we begin again? Traoré stood in the darkness of his study, overlooking the silent city. The lights of the Capitol flickered like stars grounded on earth. He didn't respond right away, not to the Americans, not to the pressure, not to the world waiting on his next word. He simply listened, to the wind, to history, to his ancestors. The next morning, he walked through the gates of a primary school newly rebuilt after French colonial neglect left it in ruins. He stood before children who didn't yet understand diplomacy but knew dignity. He knelt down to one of them, handed her a single book, and said, "This is the treaty we write now. Page by page. In our language." Across the ocean, headlines changed. Traoré turns down military pact. Burkina Faso to host Pan-African Economic Summit. White House silent after Traoré declines call. But none of it rattled him. He wasn't leading for cameras. He was leading for soil. Ocasio-Cortez, watching the developments from her New York office, finally broke her silence on the global stage again, not with opposition, but with introspection. Maybe leadership isn't about building consensus, she said, but breaking the illusions that prevent it. Traoré, invited back to the UN, declined. Instead, he sent a video message. Do not ask if we will follow your lead. Ask if you're ready to follow ours. The hall fell into a quiet more honest than applause. And that was the legacy. Not a speech. Not a headline. But a silence that meant the world had just changed direction. From Gaza to the Sahel, from Harlem to Bamako, from the UN chambers to the classroom floors, his words rippled. And with each ripple, the question grew louder in the minds of the powerful. If Traoré no longer fears them, then what, truly, do they have left to control?